we're dealing with these kinds of transcendent energy. I'm not saying don't build a fire break. That will stop some fires. But when you get into a firestorm, it becomes a different thing.
Hey there, it's Ed. I'm sharing another episode of my occasional podcast called Climate Book Reviews. I co-host it with my old friend Dr. Roger Thompson, Director of Writing Programs and Professor at Arizona State University. Our goal with the pod is to curate some climate and energy-related books worth knowing about. In this episode, we dig into Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world by author John Vaillant. Many listeners will know Vaillant from his earlier books, like The Golden Spruce and The Tiger, both gripping works of narrative nonfiction. In Fire Weather, he turns his attention to the massive 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire and what it tells us about the new era of extreme fire. We covered a lot of ground in our conversation. We talked about Vaillant's idea that wildfire is becoming a new kind of physical regime, almost a different form of weather in a warming world. We get into a slew of other topics, including how extreme fire events are entering politics and what it means for societies that built themselves in landscapes that are now primed to burn. If you're looking for one of the most vivid and unsettling climate-themed books of the past few years, this one absolutely delivers. For more info, check out climatebookreviews.com. And now over to Roger. Happy listening.
We have with us John Vaillant. Ed and I are co-hosting. Say hi, Ed.
Hey, Roger. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, and I have my signed copy, John, of Fire Weather close at hand. And I can even tell you how I came to get it signed, indirectly signed. But yeah, this is going to be fun.
Really want to express here what we have is John's tour de force. That's the only word I have for it. I really want to welcome you and really want to thank you for joining us. The book is organized in these kind of three movements. One, this kind of grounding of where we're going, but really the centerpiece is this kind of pivoting point of the big fires up in way northern Alberta. So I'm wondering, just as a kind of starting point here, I think everyone globally saw those fires. The images were just horrific, terrifying, actually, is a word that comes to mind. And I couldn't help, and at one point you talk about leering at disaster. I watched videos of that over and over again, just and hearing people's voices and the sheer terror they had during that time. So I can imagine as a writer, you saw that and you could feel some motivation, but I'm curious about how you got to, from that fire to kind of talking the history behind it makes sense, but then you move it to this last movement, which is really powerful and really, I know we'll spend some time talking about the nature of climate change. So I'm curious what prompted the book of the many things you might write about and how you got rolling on it.
The fire was unavoidable. You know, it was international news. It burned in Fort McMurray, which is the petroleum hub of Canada. And Canada's, depending on who's asking and telling, it's the fourth or fifth biggest producer of petroleum in the world. So Fort McMurray is a really important place, and it's the base for the tar sands mining. And it's not petroleum drilling. It ain't Texas. It's not the Gulf of Mexico. It's not Saudi. It's more like a strip mining operation, and it is the biggest one in the world. It's devastating in terms of its impact. It's really rough in Appalachia and really rough in Wyoming, but it's rougher. So this city caught on fire on May 3rd, 2016, and I was in Italy at a writer's retreat working on a novel. I could not have been more out of it. Made the mistake of looking at Twitter and saw this very important city in the Canadian consciousness. Really, it's probably the wealthiest municipality per capita in the country and one of the wealthiest in North America. And that's including Westchester County and Greenwich, Connecticut and Silicon Valley, so an extraordinary powerhouse of both environmental destruction, but also economic might and spectacular wages. And so this place had completely disappeared under this giant shroud of smoke on May 3rd. And I'm looking at this, from my little retreat in Italy and thinking, wow, I am really in the wrong place right now. And, it was clear that this was the biggest story in Western Canada, for whatever that's worth, in a decade, if not a quarter century. And I'm not there. And then it quickly became apparent that even if I was there, you're not getting in there. It was a disaster zone. It became a disaster zone within hours. And the fire burned in the city night and day for a week, and very few urban fires burn that way. So the Great Fire of London, 1666, burnt for 5 days. And there was the Edo fire in present day Tokyo, in the 1750s, that burnt for a few days in the city. Massive death toll. And this is a smaller city, but the fire would not leave. In fact, it kept coming back. It would blow through and then turn. And so, I'm pondering this as a writer, and you can relate to this, and the listeners maybe can. How do I grapple with this story, or do I even want to bother with it? Because already it's international news. It's the Chiron, running on BBC, and it's the Chiron running on CNN. Most people don't know about this place. And it's shocking once you understand how big it is and the impact it is. They're exporting 3 or 4 million barrels a day of the heaviest of all crudes, which is basically diluted bitumen. This stuff is so heavy, it sinks in water. Oil is supposed to float. This stuff sinks to the bottom. And, devastating, horrible stuff that requires much more rendering and intervention with natural gas heating to turn it into something that an American refinery can recognize and process. So it's the dog of the petroleum world, and yet the quantities are mind-boggling. So this is all the city where all these workers live, and where their kids are. This is a permanent settlement, about 100,000 people, was evacuated in what came to be and remains the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times. And, that's including LA. They executed this evac in, 6 or 8 hours, and with no notice, really. The tar sands, as they're known, the oil sands, are infamous, and it's a real black mark, literally, on the nation of Canada. And I'm fretting over this, and I'm thinking, well, no, I came here to write a novel, so I'm going to keep doing that. And if there's something there for me, it will reveal itself. In this studio I was in is a daybed. It's a sweet spot up in the top of this old Roman signal tower. And breezes are blowing and the birds are singing, and I take a nap behind the fluttering curtains of this thing. And I sat up out of this dream, and the dream was a Matterhorn-like mountain, a faceted alpine situation, all rock. And climbing up each face was a mountain climber soloing up the face by himself. And he had no awareness of the other climbers on the other faces. And they all summit at the same time. And that's when they became aware of each other. And so I sat up out of the dream, and I thought, petroleum industry, fire science, fire behavior, climate science, and the automobile. These were industries, sciences that all started late 18th, early 19th century. The internal combustion engine. And then here we are in Fort McMurray, this very heavy duty oil town, now overrun by a climate change enhanced fire. And here was the convergence. Here was the convergence. Here was Ouroboros swallowing its own tail. And so that's what I understood coming up out of that dream. And then I immediately started working on the proposal and sold it very quickly. If writers are listening, it's not all just in the newspaper. It's also in your subconscious. It's also in the air. It's also in, what's happening in nature, in history, on the sidewalk, out of the corner of your eye. And there's very valuable information there. I'm a nonfiction person, very fact-based. Everything needs to be verifiable. So to get inspiration from dreams sounds like the exact opposite of that. But, we're working stuff out, all the time. And if you're a writer, if you're narratively oriented, that's what your unconscious is probably going to be up to, one way or another.
working things out, but you work it out beautifully in the book. I mean, besides the big movements, what strikes me most that is really powerful is the movement out of the fire, which is just harrowing, and your descriptions are just visceral at times, really, really powerful. That move to that last part in the reckoning section, which is really about climate. This is where, again, maybe one of the sides of the mountain that you're talking about, you're essentially history of the oil industry's tackling of climate change and the way it changed so dramatically. I haven't yet read such a lucid accounting of that, and as even-handed accounting of that, the way that the industries and governmental bodies took seriously this threat for so many years, from the 50s forward, until a couple key moments shifted the story. And really what emerged then, and kind of out of my field of rhetoric, is a very incredibly effective propaganda campaign that has continued to hold sway over the American consciousness in particular for, I don't know, since at least the late 70s or early 80s. And what I'll say about that is that the narrative you give there about the sincere engagement with these issues was actually quite hopeful to me. It suggests, despite the fact that we have years of misinformation, disinformation, heightened rhetoric in really problematic ways, at root, we had initially anyway, and we still do in certain corners, even within those industries, attempts to really take this seriously and make change. And that gives me tremendous hope. And I wonder how many folks now who've grown up under kind of regimes of persuasion, I kind of want to point them all to those chapters and say, no, what you've learned here isn't right. And I just find that those opening chapters of Reckoning, I see as like probably I would describe it as an incredible public service you've done. I find myself wanting to snip them out, mail them to people I know who need to know this history. And the way you narrate it is just absolutely compelling. And maybe it's your journalistic background, fact-based storytelling on complicated and very complex issues, to kind of lucidly raise those things. It's just striking. It was just, I reread those sections. I just thought they were so great.
Thanks. And it was really, really hard to do. Not a scientist, don't have a background in that. It's a little bit like jazz, you can tell those guys are geniuses, even if it just sounds like a bunch of noise. And you can tell climate scientists and petroleum chemists, they are really, really good at what they do. The language is complex. The concepts are complex. And so I had to spend a lot of time, with those articles. And I would go back to, the original article that, came out in 1968 or 1856, where people are waking up to what CO2 is, or that maybe the issue isn't in visible smog, but in the stuff we can't see. Maybe that's where the real hazard is. And so you see these articles where people are literally, the lights are going on for them. And these are new discoveries. They have no baggage associated with it because they don't even know what's there. They don't even know how to feel about it. No one's told them how to feel about it. It's nonpartisan. It's what's in here. And so you get to see that freshness and also that earnestness. And, scientists at Exxon had it, and the Stanford Research Center Institute, I think it was, had it. That was, a seminal article. It came out in 1968. The Energy and Man Conference in 1959 at Columbia, was another seminal moment when a whole bunch of very smart, powerful people, scientists, journalists, financiers, heard about CO2 and its impact on climate for the first time. Once that can of worms was open in the 50s, the data began to pile up and pile up and pile up. And again, because it wasn't a partisan issue, you had Republicans and Democrats taking a sincere interest. And I found in the congressional record, you can see people having these conversations with climate scientists like Roger Revelle, who came out of the Scripps Institution in La Jolla, California. A founding father of American climate scientists, a brilliant guy, and the intuition these guys had, along with working with pretty limited resources, was phenomenal. And they were right. That's what is shocking, is to read these transcripts from the 1950s on Capitol Hill. It's not science fiction. It's science. It's speculative science, but it was based on hard information, which is irreversible. Like, it's happening now. And yet this skepticism has now been institutionalized. And, it is arguably the greatest betrayal in the history of the human race. And we're living in the middle of it. And it's being perpetrated, promulgated, perpetuated by the U.S. government, who used to be a leader.
Been listening in rapt attention. And John, just want to plus one what Roger said. I'm a big fan of the book. I'm sitting here with my signed copy next to me, as I said. And the story indirectly is, and I'd love to talk about the Jasper fire in a bit, but I went and had a beer with Canmore's mayor in late July. So it was the weekend after the July, I think 22nd, 2024 Jasper fire. If I might, apologies to the folks in Jasper if I got the date wrong by a couple of days, when the town was evacuated like Fort McMurray was at sudden notice because of a terrible wildfire. And we had a beer, and I urged him to read your book. And this, by the way, the Canmore mayor got a call from the province the morning after and said, how much money do you need to move forward on fire breaks? And a plan had been sort of sitting on a shelf. And today, the fire breaks that are going in are spectacular and incredible, in the sense that when you see them, it's almost hard to believe you're seeing breaks this large in the Bow Valley. It's altering trails, but it's necessary, and it's actually creating habitat patches as well. But I lent him my book. He read it, and before he gave it back to me, he attended a get-together with you at Peter Poole's house in Banff, and I think it might have been on the Mountain Book Festival. And the mayor came up to you, and he said, hey, this isn't my copy. It's my friend Ed's. Would you sign it? And you've got a very nice inscription in there.
Oh, great. Oh, good. Yeah, no, that was all a blur. That was a great meeting, though, and just a real beautiful indicator of what can be done at the community level, and to have that kind of buy-in. I think there was a fire chief there and parks people and all kinds of thoughtful, concerned citizens who really love that place, as they should. And, you had an interesting situation in Canmore, Alberta, which is another beautiful mountain town just down the road from Banff, for those who may not know. There's some huge development, I understand, that's in the process of going in near Canmore. And that I've been spending time with fire chiefs. I gave a keynote at the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, and I was just in Ottawa with them again. And what they're seeing is all this development without new fire halls and fire stations. So it's, build, but without the facilities or personnel or anything to actually protect these new communities that are now, especially in places like where you live, more vulnerable to fire than they've been in a century.
Yeah. And, I actually give props to the local folks, the fire chief, local politicians, fire ecologists, who are putting in massive fire breaks and doing it in a way that it is, I said, it can be visually jarring, and it might, for some, ruin your favorite mountain bike ride. For some, it's like, wow, this is now a really varied trail, but entirely necessary. And you can draw a direct line between that and the Fort McMurray fire, and also what happened in Jasper. But I just want to build on a couple of your points. The way that the misinformation and disinformation campaigns today, how do we counteract them? Well, you can counteract them through lawsuits. And at the risk of a shameless plug from my other podcast, Energy versus Climate, we had a guy on named Ben Franta, who is a senior fellow in the climate litigation program at Oxford Sustainable Law. And he talked about how we can use lawsuits to counter the disinformation. And we have to, because the climate science has been well established, and we've established how it's been countered by the oil and gas industry in particular. We understood the fundamental, the physics of the greenhouse gas effect, of which gases get trapped in the atmosphere. Svante Arrhenius, identified in the late 19th century how changes in CO2 would alter temperatures. And the first popular press article on the climate problem was in the 1950s in the New York Times. And the first report that really nailed the science and said what risk it poses for the United States was in the Johnson administration in the 1960s. And when you look at what's happening in the climate today, a lot of it is on track with models that predicted the effects in the early 1990s. So the science has been very stable. But I'm thinking of your book. The wonderful contribution, I think, is you write about wildfire, not just as a disaster, but almost as a new physical force, like and to quote your title, like a new species of weather. And I'm wondering, at what point did you in your research realize that it isn't just a case of climate change makes fires worse, but then we've crossed into a new regime altogether? And drawing it to present day, I still think people aren't really prepared for this new regime. Like our mental models around fire are around the old regime, not around this new regime.
It's exactly right. I mean, so much of this issue is really demands a shift in consciousness, and people, want action and they want fire breaks. In a way, that the first thing that needs to happen is to really be able to grasp that we have altered the climate so profoundly. It has been altered so profoundly that processes that we grew up with and took for granted now behave in new and different ways. And so who really coined that and articulated that beautifully is Stephen J. Pine. Started out as a wildfire fighter on the North Rim, I think, of the Grand Canyon back in the 60s, got into fire science, and he is the greatest living chronicler of fire on Earth. And he writes about fire all over the world, the cultural, the history, the science of fire. And he's got his own bookshelf, basically, of books that he's written. And so after the Fort McMurray fire in 2016, he wrote a piece for Slate, basically saying, this is a different kind of fire. We are entering what Stephen J. Pine, I'm going to call the Pyrocene age, an age of fire. And I read that article. It just felt intuitively right. So I was, following the science and following Roger Stephen Pine, who I, have admired prior. He's just a terrific writer and makes beautiful sentences too, along with his great research. When I came to understand better what occurred in the Fort McMurray fire, the temperatures that were achieved, the speed with which it moved, the totality of the combustion, these are $750,000 houses that weigh 50 tons. And, when they're standing, and there is literally nothing left but a pile of nails and the burnt shell of a refrigerator and the husk, of a car. And that's all of, nothing else. Everything else is combusted. And, apparently in some of the homes, they couldn't find the toilets. So toilets are porcelain, they're made in kilns, they're creatures of intense heat. And they had basically vaporized. The psychological impact, and there have been many fires like that now that have burnt that way, the psychological impact for the homeowner who is now looking at this absence, and there's nothing left. And so to have your life and the lives of your family erased so totally is a very strange and terrible experience, and it stays with you.
I'm struck here real quickly, just briefly, that harrowing narrative you have. It's in the Reckoning piece, I believe, of the Australian fires and the moment of the kind of fire tornado never before seen and now by chance captured, in the way that I think you described something like 300 acres just suddenly explode into are gone just in an instant,
in a tenth of a second. Yeah, it's on video, and it looks like a nuke went off. There's a hillside there with a funnel cloud behind it and fire all around, and then there's a flash, and it's gone. And that's what fire can do now. And that happened again in Redding, California in 2018. And Jasper, there were tornadic winds that picked up a huge shipping container like a sea can, and threw it into the Athabasca River. And there were these very, very heavy duty campsite grills made of heavy steel pipe, made obviously to withstand fire, but also to be immovable by drunk campers. And these things were ripped out of the ground, thrown all over the place, and totally deformed. And this isn't corrugated piping. This is solid steel tubing, so the shocking energy was released even in that fire. So that's becoming the norm now. And this is unsurvivable energy. And it's also, you can't respond to it. There's nothing a firefighter can do. A water bomber can't do anything. It's not safe even to be around winds like that. I totally respect the decision to make giant fire breaks. They're doing it around Whitehorse and the Yukon also. But that is not going to stop a firestorm, because it's the embers that burn the houses down generally. It's not the wall of fire. It's the embers that are cast and generated by these absolutely ferocious winds that these giant fires generate. So they become their own weather system, their own storm system. And then the embers do the rest. And that is, we saw this in LA too. The embers lit the houses on fire, and then the houses ignited each other. So it has nothing to do with a fire break. It has nothing to do with fire retardant. It has nothing to do with a fire truck or a fire hydrant. Those are become irrelevant. And so we're dealing with these kinds of transcendent energies. I'm not saying don't build a fire break. That will stop some fires. But when you get into a firestorm, it becomes a different thing.
Yeah, that's the fire chief of Fort McMurray. And I forget the Northern Englishman that you wrote about, personified the fire, calling it the beast. And in actuality, it's a beast, but it's like a psychotic beast, because as Jasper showed, it can be unpredictable, not just in the way it moves and behaves, but it can be unpredictable, and it can take out a block of houses, but leave one home. I'd love to know, John, how you struggle or how you deal with the attribution science debate, because part of it, those who, like you very capably make the link between climate change and these increasing severity and frequency of wildfires and new fire regimes. And yet I remember talking to Alison Karp, on the Energy versus Climate podcast, another shameless plug, forgive me. She's a molecular paleoecologist. She was at Yale when we talked to her. She was now a colleague of David Keith's at University of Chicago. And she is, true to form, saying, well, we can't say this fire's because of climate change, and this fire isn't, the same way you can't say this class 5 hurricane is because of climate change, this one isn't. You ascribe a likelihood, so this fire has a 50% likelihood of being related to climate change. And of course, that's a nuance that's lost when you're trying to advocate for action on climate and wildfire and just get people to properly protect themselves. And it's nuance that's lost. I often find in the environmental community that when there is a fire, there's at times, I think, and it's counterproductive, almost like ambulance chasing, and very quick to attribute that fire to climate change. And now look at me and my issue. How do you wrestle with it in the book?
I really look more at conditions on the ground. I hold a lot of store by attribution science. It's a real thing. And we definitely have the models now, and we certainly have the historical weather data to compare to. You don't have to be a statistician or a climate scientist or a rocket scientist to understand that what happened in Redding, California in 2018 that generated the first fire tornado, EF3 tornado generated by fire in the Northern Hemisphere, or the Fort McMurray fire in 2016, the temperatures that day were extraordinarily high. And they arrived preceded by weeks or months or even years of drought. So you have extraordinarily dry conditions now cranked up to record-breaking temperatures. And so if you set that environment on fire, you're going to get an extraordinary event that you're not going to have where I live in Vancouver in December, where it's 45 degrees and 110% humidity and everything is soaked, And so, and I think the simplest way to think about it is think of your own laundry And if I put a bed sheet out to dry today at my house, it's going to be wet this evening. It might even be wetter than when I put it out. If you put a bed sheet out in Fort McMurray on May 2nd, 2016, it would have been dry in 20 minutes. And because May 3rd broke the record temperature for that day by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And the relative humidity was 12%. Most of us don't think about humidity percentages very much, but if you think about it at all, and then you look around to see, well, where is it normal to have 12% humidity? And that's how I approached it. Again, I'm not a climate scientist. I didn't even know how to interpret particularly. I know what 100% humidity is. That's really wet and hot and sweaty. And if you're from New England, as I am, that's not comfortable summer weather. But 12% humidity, what does that mean? Well, where 12% humidity is normal is Death Valley in the month of July. We know that is an extraordinarily hot, dry place. Now transpose those conditions to northern Alberta, to one of the most flammable ecosystems on Earth, the boreal forest, which is designed to burn. And then you goose it with Southern California desert temperatures on the heels of a 2-year drought. Anybody can put that together. Something incredible is going to happen. You're not just going to have a fire. You're going to have probably a firestorm. And that's exactly what happened. So there's, if you think of it that way, and then, the attribution is sort of Monday morning quarterback, and it's sort of too late then. But meteorologists and climatologists are very, very good at what they do. They're as good as petrochemists are. They're as good at figuring out, their corner of the scientific world as petrochemists are, figuring out, is this a good place to drill? How are we going to render this quality of oil into something we can sell? They know how to do that. Climate scientists and meteorologists know how to predict. And all the predictions for Fort McMurray, likewise for Jasper, we knew weeks out that the conditions were ripe for a catastrophic fire. And so then it's just a matter of where the ignition comes from. And it really doesn't matter if it's from the muffler of a motorcycle or a lightning bolt or an arsonist. I really don't think it matters. What matters is the conditions that enable these ignitions to not just be ignitions, but to blow up into catastrophic events with extraordinary speed. And that's what we're seeing over and over again now. Just look at the weather. It's really that simple. All of us look at the weather every day. We're actually pretty good at that as civilians. Then you have a guy like a fellow I interviewed who worked in fire, but was also a marathoner, cross-country runner. And so he happened to be in Fort McMurray in early May. And he said, yeah, I went out for a run and the pine cones were crunching under my feet like it was August. We know, that grass looks really dry. That's sort of August grass. That's not May spring grass. And so we know a lot more about the weather than we may give ourselves credit for. And because, we are animals tuned to our environments, to varying degrees. And so there's a lot of data out there. And I think there's a place for attribution science, but I don't think we need it to motivate us to be more defensive around fires and certainly to decarbonize, because it's clear, where we're going, which is a hotter and more unpredictable weather scenario.
Yeah, who actually thinks of things like relative humidity of 12% in Fort McMurray? Well, it's you, climate scientists, and molecular paleoecologists like Alison Karp. However, to your point, who's thinking about fire these days? Many. And I just look at my personal life. So in my personal life, my niece Kayla is now working as a forest firefighter in the summers, just spent her first summer in Dawson Creek. That's a booming industry, young people, advantages and disadvantages, pluses and minuses, but it's unfortunately a booming field. I've had a conversation, had to tussle with my insurer around my rebuild value of my home. And that was directly precipitated by the Jasper wildfire and realizing, holy shit, I'd better check. And you write, by the way, you have this wonderful story about the insurance agent who came from the South. I want to guess Mississippi, the African-American woman. And as a proud Canadian, the better treatment that she had up in Canada than where, she is from herself, under very difficult circumstances. And then many of us, and I too, I've been touched now by knowing people personally who have lost their homes in a wildfire. And the first one for me was Bill Hamilton, a wonderful octogenarian, and he lost his place at Carbonate Landing on the west bank of the Columbia River, ironically called Carbonate Landing. So that's happening, and yet now we've got this pushback coming from conservative politicians, Trump blaming wildfire on poor forest management, Danielle Smith blaming wildfire on arsonists and nothing to do with climate change. So we're at this push-pull moment where I think awareness of wildfire has never been higher, even if I said earlier, the extent of it and the full force of it, the magnitude and the threat, our perception might still be a bit low. But we've got some senior, politicians in the highest places of office who are still trying to steer us away from root causes and find bogeymen out there to blame fires on. And I'd love to know where you sit now and years past the publication of this book. What do you think about the public consciousness, and what do we do about these politicians trying to steer us away?
So, that's a sickness in the culture. And you have to be deeply deluded and willing to be deluded to fly in the face of the obvious science that was established. When Trump was a young man, it was already pretty much settled. And so this is so clearly kind of Orwellian machinery and manipulation. It's not helpful to confront it because you're not going to. They have the intellect to know better, and they've decided that it's expedient to take this other path. And generally because they have been bought. I don't think it's a philosophical thing for Danielle Smith or Trump. I think they are mercenaries, and they just value differently. It's not an argument you're going to win. And therefore, that brings us back to the courts, which you brought up at the top. The courts are not working very well in the United States. They're limping along, but the Supreme Court is effectively compromised. And China is leading this century now. China is going to, be setting the tone. And everyone is going to have to negotiate with them. And they do want to negotiate. And they are rational about climate change. And they are leading the world many times over in the rollout of renewable energy. And they fully understand its value. Canada and the US are both still captive to the petroleum industry. And it's shocking and embarrassing and extraordinarily dangerous. But they're not the whole world. And we are in an energy transition right now. There are people and industries who don't want to admit that. Shareholders have way too much influence over this process, but it's happening anyway. And, the petroleum industry's response to that is going into plastics. The demand for petroleum is dropping, but they're going to pick up that slack through plastics. And if you want to really ruin your day, but you should have her on the show, Beth Gardner just wrote a book that's coming out, I think, in a month or two called Plastic Incorporated. It's the silent spring of petroleum. And so that's Beth Gardner. Really, I had the privilege of blurbing it, and it's a really disturbing book. So there's a lot of the world that is still science-based, and what's happening in the United States is completely unsustainable. And so just, how badly does it have to collapse before we rebuild? But reality will win in the end. And climate science is a part of that reality, renewable energy, and how incredibly cheap, efficient, and available it is. It's the most abundant energy, the cheapest energy ever conceived. And a lot of the world is super interested in expense, cheapness, and abundance. Literally, I just finished what ended up being basically a 2.5-year tour, and nothing to do with the publisher, just people like you who wanted to engage with this really urgent subject around the world. I just got back from Peru and did an interview with a climate scientist down there who's studying fires in the Amazon. And, pretty amazing to be from from Canada, from the boreal forest, and sharing common cause and common dilemmas with a Peruvian Amazon jungle scientist. And they're both burning. Both those, the boreal and the Amazon jungle, are both burning in ways that they did not used to transform a global energy system like the petroleum system. That's a 100-year task. And it's early days now, but when you look at what's happening with batteries, how quickly that technology, how quickly the cost is dropping, the storage is developing, and then the materials like lithium is almost passe at this point, and by 2030, by 2035, there are going to be batteries of sizes, weights, and materials that we can't even conceive of. And I don't, for what it's worth, I don't think the answer is AI. I think there's going to be, the answer is in good science and human beings working together, as we always have, to surmount the seemingly insurmountable. That's what we're good at. That's really our superpower as a species.
I will say one of the contributions you've made, John, is now I've seen a wildfire explosion, pardon the pun, of books now coming out on fire and ecology and climate. And I've got one sitting on my nightstand, Dark Days at Noon by Ed Struzik. I don't know if you know Ed, but he's...
Yeah. He sort of led the charge. He wrote the first, there's been probably 5 books written about the Fort McMurray fire, but he got his out, which I think is called Firestorm, a year after it came out, and really helped kind of set the table and educate he did a lot of media. It's a very good book, and really helped move the needle on understanding. And then, Dark Days at Noon is his follow-up to that. I think it just came out a year or two ago. And, but he's terrific.
I want to kind of close us out here, John. I just want to kind of give you a final word, but I can't do that without leaving some of your language in the air for us, right? There's this wonderful kind of, the best analogy I have is a kind of Carl Sagan-like moment where you're kind of zooming back and looking at the planet as a whole. And you in this one section with this phrase that I hope some poet picks up on and uses in some way, and that is, we are here by a strange and precarious grace. The idea that this planet, that we're such a thin atmosphere, we're so in this kind of one. It's just beautiful. It gives me goosebumps, which I actually literally have right now. That phrasing is just so wonderful. And so I guess I want to close out here with you giving us a word on what do we do with that wisdom that we are here by a strange and precarious grace. What would you advise us toward?
Boy, I'm 63 years old now, and again, spent basically my 50s, working on this book. And I've got a couple of kids who are growing up, in this, precarious grace, but also real, climate precarity. It really is uncertain. We don't know exactly what's coming. To me, that just emphasizes the need to really understand the power of love, and for each other, for the people around us, for the ideas that resonate for us, for the land that supports us and nurtures us and enables everything, and as invisible as it is, for the climate and for the weather, and which, is really, that's the atmosphere is really, if you think of like an amniotic sac, that contains everything and that nurtures us, through this, vulnerable time. That is kind of what our atmosphere is. We live in this sack of vapor and gas, and it enables everything we do. It enables every argument we have, and every joy we experience, and every lesson we learn, and every piece of wise advice that we ignore. It enables us to do all those things. It gives us enormous freedom. And so, to celebrate that and honor that, in ways that nurture each other and nurture the chances of the systems that keep us alive continuing to be able to do that for as long as possible. And we as humans are really the only species that gets to decide that. That's what's really extraordinary. It's not a wholesome burden for any species to bear. We shouldn't have that much power. but we do. And there are systems that we can engage in that can move that needle in different directions. And it's incumbent upon us to learn what those are in our communities, figure out where the levers are, figure out the ones that we can actually grasp onto and move with whatever skills and resources we can bring to bear, and to engage in that actively. But it's also an incredibly exciting time. It's a period of wide awakening and incredible speed of events, both on the natural side and on the technological and cultural side. And so we've really never lived in a more dynamic, fast-moving time, but we have brains and bodies that can handle that, and social systems that can handle it. But it requires a conscious engagement with all of those. And so it's galvanizing.
I would say that I love ending with love. And I can say that in reading this book, despite some of the harrowing narrative and the difficult history of confronting us in it, it is obvious the love for our planet that shines through in this. And let me just say, for lovers of language, you will be rewarded by picking up any John Vaillant book. And this is no exception to that. So, John, thank you so much for joining Ed and me, and hope to connect with you in person sometime in not too distant future.
Let's do it in Arizona or Alberta, two of the greatest places in North America. You're lucky to be there. And this is, what a really pleasant way to spend a rainy morning. So I really appreciate that. And thanks for your interest. Thanks for reading. And let's hoist one sometime.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emmett Tandon with help from Michael Edmonds. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with the support of the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, the Trottier Family Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com, and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help new listeners to find the show.